Welcome, everyone. It is such a joy to welcome all of you. My name is Rabbi Eli Friedman from Congregation Road of Shalom, and I'm really just honored to be here tonight and to welcome you all to this wonderful program, Count Their Names, the Nazi persecution of LGBTQ people. We are at Road of Shalom. We like to begin every program with a little bit of relationship, and part of what it means to be at our congregation is to create profound connections, and it's all about with each other. And so what I normally, if we were in person, I'd have you all turn to someone next to you and introduce yourself and say hi, but maybe, I heard Roberta, perfect. I love that. That was adorable. But maybe feel free to jot if you want to jot down in the chat. You can just, I see a couple people did it already, which is so wonderful. You can introduce yourself if you want to say where you're from and just say hi. It's so wonderful. I see a few people doing that already, Chelsea and Judy and Tammy and others. And that way we can at least be in a little bit of community. And it's really wonderful to see people from all over.
Oh, wow.
From all over. Yeah, look at that. All the way from Texas to Mount Airy. We like to begin, I'd like to begin with just a word of Torah and really helping to frame the importance of tonight. This week in our Torah portion, we are in Parshat Mishpatim, which means laws. Last week we had the huge pivotal moment of revelation at Mount Sinai, where the Israelites received the 10 commandments, the 10 sort of big laws. And then this week, we get into all the rest of the laws, the little things. But it's in some of these laws that we find some of our most important ethical and moral commandments. And I'll point this specifically to one commandment we find in Exodus 22, verses 20 and 21. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress them, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You should not ill-treat any widow or orphan. The widow, the orphan, and the stranger are typically in Judaism this category that we see repeated quite a bit as really the most vulnerable in ancient times from what our ancestors sort of understood. And they represent those in society that really need the most protection. Tonight, we are going to be in honor of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which I always make a point just to remind for folks that this is different from Yom HaShoah, which is really our Jewish specific Holocaust Remembrance Day. International Holocaust Remembrance Day not only recognizes the atrocities and the 6 million Jews that were killed, but also is a day for the entire world. It began with the UN in 2005, is a chance for the entire world to recognize the atrocities of the Holocaust to Jews and to other persecuted groups. And tonight, specifically looking at the LGBTQ community. When we look at this idea that we were strangers in Egypt, we understand what it means. We should have empathy. I know for us at Congregation Road of Shalom and our partners at JProud, at Federation, I'll mention a little more, at the Holocaust Remembrance Foundation, also recognize that we have an obligation to speak to the persecution of the LGBTQ and to understand how that's really ongoing. I'll just share a little story that's so relevant today that unfortunately, even in 2022 in Philadelphia, my daughter, who is in second grade, came home from school today and told me she was really upset because someone in her class made a homophobic comment. And we talked about it, and we talked about ways she could use her voice to kind of speak out against that. And but we recognized that there was sort of a double harm that was very much done with the LGBT community, both during the Holocaust and then the continued persecution afterwards. And so understanding our obligation to protect the most vulnerable in our community, understanding that those in the LGBT community still face a tremendous amount of persecution today, I'm really just honored tonight to be with all of you. I'm going to first welcome, we have a number of, as I mentioned, a number of co-sponsors tonight. First, I want to just lift up PRISM, which is the RS LGBTQ plus connection group, and the leadership of Heshi Zinman and Ellen Poster, who really, from our Road of Shalom family, did such a wonderful job to create this program. I want to lift up the Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation, the JProud, a program of Jewish Family and Children's Services Greater Philadelphia, and the William Way LGBT Community Center as all those wonderful partners. Lastly, I want to specifically thank the Leo Brenner Holocaust Fund at Road of Shalom for helping to sponsor this program tonight, and specifically our wonderful congregants Ira and Roberta, and there's a whole lot of Brenners and even more of the family. And turn it over to Ira and Roberta just to say a word about why it was important for them to help sponsor this program tonight in honor of Ira's father, Leo.
Thank you very much, Rabbi, and good evening, everyone. This is really a fantastic turnout. The Leo Brenner Fund was originally established by my mother, my sisters, Joy and Gail, who are here tonight, and me to honor my father's memory. It is important to fund Holocaust education projects such as tonight's. Since we moved the fund to Road of Shalom a few years ago, the fund has almost doubled in size, and we hope that it will double again soon so we can continue to be much more active. My father survived Auschwitz, and he witnessed virtually every atrocity that we could imagine and every atrocity that we dare not to imagine. He kept most of his memories to himself until later in life. And when he did speak out, he was very clear about the dangers of hate speech turning to violence. And we saw it all ourselves a little more than a year ago. Modern day American, not German brown shirts, proclaiming 6 million weren't enough, attacked our own Capitol building. This evening's program focuses on a group that's not always included in this monstrous number. They must be remembered also. After all, remembrance is a very powerful antidote to hate crimes and lies. My father would be very proud to know that he had helped tonight's effort just a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Ira, and the entire Brenner family. It's now my honor to introduce our moderators for this evening, Galia Godel, who is the JProud Program Manager from Jewish Family and Children's Services of Greater Philadelphia, and Sophia Don, Senior Program Manager of Programs and Operations at the Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation. And lastly, to introduce our featured speaker this evening, Dr. Jake Newsome. Jake is an award-winning scholar of German and American LGBTQ history, whose research and resources educate global audiences. His forthcoming book, Pink Triangle Legacies, Coming Out in the Shadow of the Holocaust, chronicles the ongoing struggles for the acknowledgement and memorialization of the Nazis' LGBTQ plus victims. It also traces the transformation of the Pink Triangle from a concentration camp badge in Nazi Germany into a symbol of queer activism, pride, and community beginning in the 1970s. In addition to serving as a historical advisor for film projects, podcasts, and plays, Dr. Newsome has been invited by the French, UK, and US governments to speak about the important lessons that LGBTQ history has for all of us today. He now works as a museum professional in Washington, D.C. It's my honor now to turn things over to Galia, to Sophia, and to Dr. Jake Newsome. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. And thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you to our partners. This was really a wonderful process to put this program together. It has been really educational. It's been really fun in so many ways, even with such an important and such an intense topic. So Dr. Jake Newsome, thank you so much for being here with us. We are very much ready to learn from you and your expertise. So to get started, first, can you tell us about how you became interested in researching this topic?
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. And before we dive into that, I just want to take a moment to again, thank all of the organizers and for the invitation to join all of you for this, to mark this really solemn and important occasion as we mark the 77th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. So it truly is an honor for me to be here with all of you together from, as we saw, from all over the country to commemorate the victims of the Holocaust. So to get back to your question, people often ask me that, you know, how did you get into studying this topic? And it's not a real simple answer. I didn't have a direct family connection to the Holocaust. I'm not Jewish. My family, you know, weren't in the army. They weren't liberators. And so I ended up studying the Holocaust at college as a way for it to try to understand what this history could tell us about what it means to be human. And so I studied in undergraduate, I took every single course on Nazi Germany, on the Holocaust that our university offered. And of course, by the end of those 4 years, in typical kind of young college student fashion, I just assumed that I knew everything that there was to know about the Holocaust. And so I was incredibly surprised then in the very last semester to attend a lecture that was about the so-called men with the pink triangle. So the gay concentration camp prisoners. And it was after 4 years, the first time that I had learned about this particular victim group. Of course, I'd always read in kind of the definitions of the Holocaust, there was always a list kind of at the end of the section on, well, there were, besides the Jews, there were other victims, but nothing in detail. And I left that lecture feeling not only mad that I hadn't studied, you know, I studied this for 4 years and hadn't learned anything about it, but also a little mad at myself. Because as at that time, a young man who was in the process of coming out and figuring out what it meant for me to be gay, I was also confused about why I hadn't personally thought to ask about, you know, what happened to people like me during the Holocaust. And so when I did begin asking, you know, professors or begin reading about this particular victim group, I was always told that, well, you don't know anything about it because after the war, homosexuality remained such a taboo that no one spoke about it, not even the gay survivors themselves. And so at the time, it kind of made sense to me, because how can historians be blamed for writing a history that wasn't there? And so I thought, again, with this kind of level of naivete, that I was going to go to grad school and I was going to be the one to finally break this silence. And so then I was, you know, surprised to begin learning that there were a handful of scholars who had researched this topic and published on it. I went to Germany, went into the archives expecting to find nothing, right? Because everyone told me that there just wasn't anything to know, there wasn't anything to find. And you can imagine I was floored when I got there and just found mountains and mountains of material. Everything from, you know, diaries and personal correspondence from LGBTQ folks themselves, but also court records and police documentation. So an official record of what happened to LGBTQ folks during the Nazi regime. And so suddenly my research questions shifted, because what had started as an interest in what happened to LGBTQ folks during the Holocaust later turned into what is now a 10-year research project on their continued persecution after the Holocaust, and how the silencing of their stories and ultimately had deadly consequences.
Thank you. So before we get into the era of the Holocaust, can you tell us what life was like for LGBTQ people in Germany before the Nazis came to power? And I also want to just note for those listening, if anybody has questions during the program, you can put them in the chat and we'll have a couple periods for Q&A during the whole program.
Thanks. So it's important to realize that before the Nazis came to power, Germany was actually quite a welcoming place for folks that we would today call members of the LGBTQ community. After Germany was defeated in World War I, there was a democracy established known as the Weimar Republic. And and part of this idea of living in a democracy is that individuals had more civil liberties. And so we saw, and you see between let's say 1919 and 1933, a flourishing of rights for minorities and marginalized communities in Germany, like women, political minorities, and LGBTQ people, at least in the bigger urban areas like Berlin. And I would say that really by the 1920s, especially Berlin, had become an unofficial gay capital of the world. So folks traveled there from New York, from London, from Paris to experience this incredibly dynamic queer culture that included publications and bars and gay rights organizations and cafes and shops. The readership of gay magazines or gay newspapers in Germany was over 1 million people. So this was quite a dynamic scene, dynamic culture. But I do want to say that it probably, I don't want to paint it in too much of a positive kind of paradise. LGBT folks certainly didn't enjoy full acceptance, but it was an unprecedented level of tolerance. And one of the stories that I would like to share, I'm going to share my screen real quick. To help demonstrate the level of social progress that existed in the Weimar Republic is the story of a man named Gerd Kotter. So Gerd was born and assigned female at birth, but knew from early on that he was a man. He eventually quit using his given name and started going by Gerd. And so you can see a picture of Gerd here. At this time, there were places, institutions that would help trans people like Gerd to navigate their life much more efficiently and safely. So for example, Gerd was able to go to what was known as the Institute for Sexual Science, which was founded by a gay Jewish socialist physician named Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, that was there to not only study and advocate for, but provide services for folks in the LGBTQ community. And so Gerd was able actually to go to the Institute and apply for what was known at the time as a transvestite pass. This was the term used in the early 1900s. So she was actually able to go get you see here on the right, a medical doctor's note, essentially signed by Magnus Hirschfeld, asserting that Gerd was clinically, medically, socially a man, and therefore should have the right to wear men's clothing without being arrested or harassed by the police department. So Hirschfeld had actually gone and forged a relationship with the Berlin Police Department. And what you see on the left is actually the note with the official stamps from the police department that Gerd could carry with him in his wallet, so that if anyone ever stopped him and had questions about his identity, he could produce this pass to say that he was legally a man and should not be harassed. So this was an incredibly progressive place in a lot of ways. Again, of course, there were a lot of problems. There was still an anti-gay law on the books called Paragraph 175 that criminalized gay relationships between men. And even while there was all this progress happening, the number of arrests under Paragraph 175 actually rise during the Weimar Republic, because as Berlin is kind of loosening its policing of LGBT people, the rest of Germany, especially the small rural parts, are trying to crack down. And so if you average that out nationally, the number of arrests actually increases during the Weimar Republic.
Just lower the volume.
If anybody is not muted, if you can mute yourselves, just to make sure that we don't have any rogue sound coming in. So Jake, can you tell us why did the Nazis see LGBTQ people as a threat to Germany?
Well, so am I off mute? Yes. Okay. So while homophobia was never quite as central to Nazi ideology as, for example, anti-Semitism was, but they clearly made their stance on the issue known from even before they fully came to power. And it was for, I would say, probably three main reasons. The first being that the top priority for the Nazi regime was procreation of the so-called, master race. So anything that got on the way of that was seen as a threat. So really, LGBTQ folks were seen as robbing the fatherland of offspring, of future children that could be so-called good Aryans. But number two, the Nazis believed that, and honestly, this wasn't quite unique to the Nazis, but that gender inversion, supposed gender inversion, so gender expressions that existed beyond the kind of traditional gender norms, created weakness. So men who were supposedly effeminate were seen as a weakness and as a threat to the state, at the same time that masculine women rather were seen as giving up their kind of motherly duties and as good housewives. And so for the Nazis, really, it was both the sexual orientation and gender identity that seemed to pose threats. And I will say that this is not just something that a handful of low-level Nazis were concerned about. It went all the way to the very top. And so here you see a quote from Himmler in 1937 telling his SS lieutenants that all things which take place in the sexual sphere are not the private affair of the individual, but signify the life and death of the nation. So this is something that the very top Nazis were understanding as a threat to the procreation of their so-called master race.
We've already had actually a couple of questions come into the chat that I think we're all curious about. But did the Nazis treat all LGBTQ people the same? Or were there, for example, different policies for gay men versus lesbians versus transgender people?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Out of kind of everyone in the LGBTQ community, the Nazis saw cisgender, gay, and bisexual men as the most dangerous because in Nazi Germany, it was men who had access to positions of authority, right? And so they were afraid that if a gay man or a bisexual man was able to get into a position of power, that they posed the most direct threat to the state. And so that is why the Nazis really concentrated their efforts on gay and bisexual men. So again, I mentioned earlier this law called Paragraph 175. It was already on the books when the Nazis came to power, and so they had this national law kind of already in their arsenal that they could use to arrest men who were even suspected of having sex with another man. There really was no single law against being lesbian or being transgender or any of the other identities that was comparable to Paragraph 175 for men. But the Nazis frequently used a number of other laws that were at their disposal, such as laws against vagrancy or panhandling. So, for example, a lot of LGBT people were marginalized or they were fired, and so they were often poor or homeless, and so the Nazis were able to use laws against vagrancy to arrest LGBTQ folks. The Nazis used a wide range of laws to persecute queer women. There was Paragraph 74, which was against sex with dependents, the laws against child abuse or public nuisances. So really the Nazis didn't even really need a specific law like Paragraph 175 for each of the different members of the LGBTQ community, because they already had a number of laws that were vague enough that they could use to go after them.
So you've explained, I mean, really clearly, thank you, kind of the why, but can you tell us a little bit about the how? So in other words, we've been talking about Nazi ideology and how the Nazis understood LGBTQ people, but can you now tell us a little bit about the persecution against this group and what that looked like? So like, was it similar to other groups that were persecuted? What tools did the Nazis use?
So, I mean, as it was similar in the persecution of other groups in a number of ways, but it was also unique. As the Nazis sought to create a uniform society, it created a lot of groups that were kind of in the out group. As I mentioned, the Nazis thought that LGBTQ folks were clearly one of those groups that should not belong in the new Germany. And I think it's important to point out here that the Nazis didn't believe that LGBTQ folks existed as a separate group of people. They didn't believe that someone was born gay, for example. They believed that being gay was a vice, it was a choice, and because it was a choice, allegedly someone could be cured from making those choices. And so I believe that actually saved them from being automatically slated for physical elimination, because they could, at least theoretically, be reoriented and cured back and then be reintegrated back into members of society. So keeping that in mind, the Nazis believed that you would think that having this national law already on the books, paragraph 175, would have been really convenient for them. But they believed that the way that the law was worded was actually too constricting. And so what they did in June of 1935, which is the same time that they're writing the Nuremberg race laws, is amend paragraph 175 and makes the wording incredibly vague, which gives them, unprecedented legal authority to go after men that were even suspected of being gay. And that really, after the June of 1935 amendment, there's essentially no evidence required whatsoever to get a conviction. So they amend paragraph 175. Heinrich Himmler creates a central headquarters for combating homosexuality and abortion there in Berlin, and they rely on a number of tools, such as local police stations have been keeping what were called pink lists. So these were names and addresses of men who were even, again, accused of being gay. And so the Nazis were able to march in, get these lists, and go after these men. But I do also want to share the story of another person. So let me share my screen again. A man named Richard Gruna, who was an artist. He was in his 20s when he moved to Berlin to experience that famous gay culture that I had mentioned at the beginning. But unfortunately for him, Hitler had been appointed chancellor only 2 weeks before he moved to Berlin. As the Nazis were closing down these gay spaces in the public, gay people like Richard had to essentially meet in their houses to try to stay out of the public sphere. And so Richard hosted a series of parties in 1934 for his gay friends. But unfortunately, it turns out that one of the party attendees, one of the few women that were there, was actually going around and taking the names, addresses, and professions of every person that was there. And by December, she went to the Gestapo with a long list of gay men. And so in December of 1934, Richard, along with 70 other men, were arrested from the denunciation of this one party goer. And it turns out that this denunciation was not unique. And in fact, if you look at the archives, 1/3 of all cases against gay men that made it to conviction were the result of civilian denunciation. And so to me, this shows that clearly German citizens took it upon themselves, right, to be able to understand the power of what a denunciation would do, especially after the 1935 amendment, where they knew that no evidence was required. And so we see Germans actively turning in gay men and other LGBTQ folks to the Gestapo, leading to their arrest, and in some cases being sent to a concentration camp. So I will show this slide with some stats right here. During the course of the Nazi reign, they arrested about 100,000 men under paragraph 175, ultimately convicting just over half of those. And you can see here from this graph that after the 1935 amendment, I mean, the numbers just skyrocket. In fact, they rise by 743%. Ultimately, about 7,000 to 10,000 of these men who were classified as so-called repeat offenders were sent to concentration camps.
What was the situation like for LGBTQ people inside the concentration camps, for those that were sent there?
Yeah, so in order to answer that question, I want to bring the story of a man named Ernst Pack, who you see here on your screen. Ernst he served honorably in the German military. After he left the service, he took over his family's construction firm. But he was arrested in September of 1938 under paragraph 175, and he served a 2-month prison sentence. He was released, but then arrested again in November of 1942 after the police had put him under surveillance. So at that point, he was sentenced to 10 months of hard labor in prison. And even before Ernst was released, the police chief of Essen wrote to the local regional Gestapo boss and asked that Ernst be taken into so-called preventative detention in a concentration camp. And the letter is just really illuminating. So I want to read it to you, quoting this again. This is the Essen police chief writing to the Gestapo. He says, in order for Pack to agree to a better way of life and to divert him from his vices, I consider a longer and stricter incarceration in a camp absolutely necessary. It's only through the implementation of measures is there hope for an improvement in his return to the German community. So men like Ernst, who were sent to concentration camps under paragraph 175, again, which included gay men, bisexual men, and transgender women, and probably some straight men who were falsely accused as well. They all got a badge that signaled their so-called crime whenever they were interred into the concentration camps, just like any other prisoner. Sometimes gay men were labeled with a green triangle, marking them as as a criminal prisoner. Sometimes they had a big 175 stone on their uniforms, but by the late 1930s, the standard became the pink triangle. So as we saw, about 7,000 to 10,000 of the so-called repeat offenders were sent to camps. That was a very small number in each of the camps. So usually less than 1% of all camp prisoners were gay prisoners. And so this meant that they really couldn't form a sense of community in the way that some of the other prisoner groups were. We know that homophobia didn't stop at the barbed wire. So gay men faced discrimination, not only from the guards, but from their fellow inmates as well. And camps were seen by the Nazis really as a violent form of conversion therapy. The idea was that hard labor in a camp was, labor was manly. So by subjecting these men to hard labor, it would somehow reorient them back to being, straight. So Ernst Pack, as I said, he was transferred in September of 1943 to a concentration camp. And after a few months, the authorities decided that behavioral therapy was just not going to work on him. So they told Pack that he could leave the concentration camp only if he submitted to so-called voluntary castration. So here is this 50-year-old man. He knows that the Germans are losing the war. The only certainty if he stayed in a concentration camp was more suffering. And in February of 1944, he signed a piece of paper that gave the camp doctor the authority to castrate him. The form, which you see here on your screen, translated says, I hereby request my castration and submit this appeal voluntarily so that I may be freed of my pathological sexual desires. The final sentence must have filled him with dread. It says, I have been explicitly informed that this voluntary castration does not grant me the right to release from preventative detention. We know that Ernst Pack was released 7 months later after being castrated, but we don't know what happened to him after the war. In a way, Pack was lucky in that he survived, because out of all the gay prisoners in the camp, 65% died. And so it leaves one wondering how serious the Nazis' policy to cure these men and integrate them back into society really was when there was a mortality rate of 65%.
Wow, that's a horrible story. And thank you for sharing and I think giving us this really good both context and this history of persecution during the Holocaust. But as we all know, as all of the the audience folks who are here know, the second half of the program is about the persecution after the Holocaust. So before we get into that section, there have been a few questions that have come through the chat. So I wanted to ask a few of them, but don't worry if we don't get to your questions, we will move them towards the end. So one question is, what would happen if a person fell into more than one category of persecuted group? So if somebody was Jewish and gay, how would that person be classified? And I want to ask if that's also related to the graphic that was shared on the poster or the flyer that was used for this program that had all of the triangles on it.
And thanks for referencing that poster. As you can see from that poster, there's different colored triangles for different prisoners, right? And at the bottom of that graph, you can actually see where theoretically different colored triangles can be overlapped with each other. So for example, if you were Jewish and gay, theoretically, you would have a pink triangle and a yellow triangle overlaying with each other. In practical terms, though, I have never seen, and I don't know of any researcher who has ever seen that overlapping of triangles actually taking place. Because, for example, most of the time, for example, if you were Jewish, the Nazis saw that as your primary so-called crime, and actually that superseded any other reason you might have fallen, foul of Nazi laws. And so there are stories of gay, Jewish men, for example, who were, labeled with a yellow star and sent to Auschwitz, for example. The fact that they were gay normally was just subsumed underneath that. It's really interesting, though, how we today are beginning to think more intersectionally, right? That we all have different identities. We're not ever just gay or just Jewish or just a political campaigner. We all wear those hats at the same time. The Nazi classification system completely separated all of those things, and so it ignored the intersectionality of people, and it really left it up to essentially the individual who happened to be doing the intake forms at that time at any particular camp, kind of how they decided you were going to be classified in the camp if there was some overlap.
Gotcha, thank you. And then the other question that I'll ask, and then we'll go to our second part of the program, is, can you discuss, and I'm sure this could be a whole other program in and of itself, but the Ernst Röhm, the highest ranking gay Nazi. So however, I guess the the crash course in, if you can tell us a little bit about him and his identity.
So I will say that Ernst Röhm, I was listening to a podcast the other day that called Ernst Röhm the first openly gay politician. And I guess to an extent, it probably is true. Ernst Röhm was a gay man who was one of the most powerful Nazis that there was. He joined the Nazi Party before Hitler. He was one of these early believers, and it was quite well known that he was gay. He's a troublesome character, right? Because we assume that to be gay meant you were only a victim in the Nazi in Nazi Germany. But again, we're bringing in this idea of intersectionality, that just because one is gay doesn't mean that one can also be racist or anti-Semitic. And so there were a number of gay people who were drawn to Nazi ideology, who believed that that they belonged to the so-called master race, but just as there were, clearly plenty of straight people too, so that the sexual orientation didn't so much matter at that point. I will say that clearly a lot of the top Nazis knew about Röhm being gay. Hitler actually protected Röhm and said, this is his sexual life is private. We shouldn't be talking about it. And he only got rid of Röhm when it became politically expedient to do so. And so the actually was the left, the communists and the socialist parties were trying to damage the Nazi party by saying, look, they're saying they're going to clean up Germany, but they have gay people in their own party. And so it became a risk for the Nazis to have an openly gay man at such a high ranking position. And so Hitler moved and had Röhm murdered. of course, right after that, he was able to say that, like, look, now we're showing you how dedicated we are to purging Germany, because we're willing to purge our own party of this so-called vice.
Thank you so much for answering. I do recognize that could be a whole other talk, but thank you so much for talking with me. It's been a pleasure to ask you these questions. Pleasure isn't the right word, but
Sure. Yeah,
you get what I mean. I'm gonna turn the moderator mic over to Galia to talk about the post-war period. So thank you.
thanks, Sophia.
Thank you so much, Sophie. So this has been so fascinating and illuminating to discover a whole new depth to the experience of individuals during the Nazi era. But we've got some questions about post-war persecution. Not everyone experienced the defeat of Nazi Germany the same way. Can you tell us about the situation of LGBTQ people in Germany in the immediate aftermath of World War II?
Yeah, I mean, you think that, right, the Holocaust is over, the war is over, and things are surely going to look up, and that's actually what a lot of the LGBTQ folks thought after the war, that now, you know, the Allies have won. They've, you know, fought this war on the basis of freedom and democracy, so things are going to finally get better. And I guess they got better in the sense that there weren't any more concentration camps after the defeat of Nazi Germany. But the Allies, including the United States, when they came into the camps, they were instructed by Allied High Command that they were to release the prisoners that were there on the basis of religious or racial or political persecution. But so-called common criminals were meant to be, you know, continuously arrested or imprisoned, rather. And so since the Allies said, well, these gay men broke a national law, paragraph 175, they're criminals. And so the men, the gay concentration camp prisoners who still had a prison sentence, you know, left on their term, the Allies took them straight from a concentration camp to, you know, the closest prison, where those men were then forced to serve out the rest of their time. Afterwards, the LGBT survivors were summarily excluded from the process of compensation. They were not even allowed to apply. A handful of gay men, we're talking 14 gay men, decided that they were going to just apply anyway and hope that, you know, someone would show them some goodwill. But all 14 men were denied in the new West German government. The fate of lesbians was also pretty fraught. So, for example, there was a woman named Hilda Radusch. She was a longtime member of the Communist Party. She was even imprisoned in 1943 for opposing the Nazis. I mean, she was an active opposition. But after the war, she decided she wanted to quit the Communist Party, start a life. But her party leadership didn't want her to go. And so what they did was essentially out her. They wrote to all their field offices and said, no one hire Hilda, she's a lesbian. And she essentially was never able to find work again. And she said, quote, that a piece of my life's dream was destroyed at this moment. You know, there are other examples of, I found one example of a Jewish woman who sought to get compensated, you know, because she was Jewish. But during the process, the reviewers found out that she was a lesbian, and they denied her claim for Jewish compensation because she also happened to be a lesbian. West Germany throughout the years continuously upheld paragraph 175, the Nazi version. The Allies had gone through and tried to do a denazification process where they were going to get rid of all these Nazi laws, but they allowed the Nazi version to stay on the books. And so when West Germany and East Germany were created in 1949, both of those countries had the Nazi version of the law. The West German court system continuously upheld that version. And so I in 1957 essentially said there's going to be no more debate about it. This is not a Nazi law. We know that Nazis amended it, but they were really just trying to get at the true spirit of this law, and we still need this law. And so I'm going to share my screen again. If you remember the graph that I showed earlier with the number of annual convictions. If you extended that to look at the first years of West Germany, this is what it would look like. Okay, so you see this very marked rise again in the number of arrests and convictions of gay men using this Nazi law in West Germany.
Wow, that's really overwhelming information. You've spoken mostly about West Germany. Was the situation any different in East Germany?
Yeah, so the communist government of East Germany chose to get rid of the Nazi version of paragraph 175. I mean, less than a year, within a few months of being founded, East Germany went back to the original 1871 version of the pre-Nazi version of the law, not because they were pro-gay rights by any means, but because part of the communist identity was being anti-fascist, right? And so they could not justify including a fascist law in their new government. So because they used the original version of paragraph 175, they arrested, only about 100 men. I say only, but that's still a lot, right? But in comparison to West Germany, only 100 men per year, because they thought that it was a so-called victimless crime. So they actually fully repealed paragraph 175 in 1968, which was actually a year before West Germany did.
So as you mentioned, West Germany amended paragraph 175 in 1969 to finally get rid of the Nazi version of the law. What were some of the significant outcomes of that amendment?
So I would say, at least for our conversation this evening, is it cleared the way for the emergence of a new gay rights movement in Germany. And in a lot of ways, you can kind of see it as the resurgence of the movement from like the Magnus Hirschfeld's era. That was really the forefront of gay rights across the world. After we get rid of this Nazi version of the law in 1969, there's a sudden reemergence of gay rights activism across West Germany. And part of, and this is not just in Germany, it's really across Western Europe and North America, at this point in time, coming out, so publicly claiming and using a gay identity was seen as not just a personal decision, but it was a political action as well, right? This idea that, you in a democracy, you had the right to not just be gay in private, but claim and publicly be queer in the public life. And so this was a big goal of the gay rights movement in West Germany. They wanted as many people as possible to come out to show their straight counterparts that, look, you know a gay person. You might not know it, but you do, right? And we are here, and we actually can be a formidable political force if necessary. But there was this big debate about how would people come out, right? Because there were some who were maybe gender nonconforming, effeminate men, for example, that it's like they were always kind of pegged by society as gay. But what about gay people who could pass as straight? So the idea was to adopt a gay logo, a gay symbol, something that gay people could wear that instantly would tell people walking in society that, hey, I'm gay and I'm part of this new movement. So then the question became, what is going to be the symbol, this new gay symbol that we're all going to adopt? There were a lot of different suggestions, but ultimately in 1972, the very first autobiography by a gay concentration camp survivor was published. And the name of that book was The Men with the Pink Triangle. And so suddenly they had their answer. They adopted the pink triangle as this new gay logo, as a way to not only show people that they were queer, but also to reclaim this negative symbol and say, you no longer have power over us. This is going to be a marker of identity and pride. So in this part, right, in this moment, Holocaust memories became a tool to fight for social justice in the present, right, by forming historical roots for this new kind of out politicized gay identity, one that was filled with pride. But it also, by choosing a symbol that was a concentration camp badge, it also acted as a warning of what would happen if governments continued to persecute minorities and if citizens remain complacent. So I just want to show, as we go to the next question, leave this up on the screen. Really, by the 1980s, the pink triangle had become the most widespread symbol of gay rights across the entire world.
That's amazing. Sort of related to this autobiography that you mentioned and the fact that these pink triangles became so widespread in conversation, when and how did the history of the Nazis' LGBTQ victims begin to be included in history books?
So as we saw, right, or as I briefly mentioned, that after the war, I mean, there was just an imposed silence on this victim group. It wasn't that there was just silence. It was that the government, academia, everybody was using its authority to just completely make it honestly illegal to be able to share your experiences if you were a gay survivor. It was not until 1977 that a man named Rudiger Lautmann, a researcher from Bremen, first used archival evidence to really get into the details of what happened to gay men during the Nazi regime. And then in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a big wave of scholarship, really by LGBTQ folks themselves. And so there was no institutional support from university history departments or museums or federal grants or any of these things that normally we think of as supporting scholarship. All the doors to scholarship were closed to anyone trying to research this topic. And so these folks were out there having to do grassroots research. So it was that these same people who were the ones, holding picket signs and going to demonstrations were also the ones rummaging around in the archives to write their own history. And so especially, today on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, where we're remembering is so important, I did want to just, throw a few of these names and photographs up on the picture of these people who were doing that pioneering research. Folks like Rudiger Lautmann, James Steakley brought this information to an English-speaking audience for the first time in the early 70s. Folks like Claudia Schottmann and Ilse Kokulo in the 80s and the 90s, and still to this day remain essentially one of the two only people who were researching the fate of lesbians in the Third Reich. More recently, since the year 2000, there's been more of a rise, a growing network of scholars in Europe and North America, including those who see here, that are just completely helping us rethink how we understand these experiences and ultimately the Holocaust itself. And so it would not be possible for us to sit here and remember LGBT victims without the work done by these pioneering researchers. So I just wanted to take that moment to speak their names and thank them for their work as well. Am I frozen?
I think Galia is frozen.
Oh no, okay.
Galia, go ahead.
Well, maybe this could be a moment where we could take a question from the chat. Sophie, I don't know, I can't see the chat from my screen.
Sure. Okay, I am going to let me look back here.
So sorry about that. Must have had an internet jump. What was the last thing you heard me say, Dr. Newsome?
So I was just wrapping up the point about giving credence to the researchers who have done this work, and how if a marginalized community wants a history that liberates itself from the confines of silence, they often have to write it themselves.
Absolutely. And something that's been sitting with me through this conversation, I wanted to ask, did LGBTQ victims ever receive compensation from the German government?
Well, the short answer is no. And to my knowledge, no LGBTQ victim has received official compensation from the German government. In the original compensation legislation, gay men were completely excluded. But in 1987, there was kind of this loophole. There was mounting pressure from different, activist groups for the West German government to finally compensate all these other victim groups that have been left out. So not just gay people, but people with disabilities, Roma and Sinti, Jehovah's Witnesses, for example. And so in 1987, the West German government did pass what they called a hardship fund. But it was literally written into the description that no one should acknowledge this as official compensation or as a acknowledgement of guilt or responsibility on the part of the German government. But it was essentially posed as charity, that we are going to help. Yes, you experienced some hardship in the war. We're going to help you by giving you some money. A handful of people, gay men, did apply to get it. And it was really based on legal statutes. And so only people arrested under paragraph 175 were eligible to apply. So it was really only for gay men. It was if you were a lesbian or another member of the LGBTQ community, you weren't even eligible to apply then. A handful of people did get a one-time payment, but again, it was not official compensation. And so it wasn't until 2002 that the now unified German government officially apologized to gay victims, recognized them as official victims, and said that they're eligible for compensation. But that was 2002. By that point, any gay survivor would have been probably in their late 80s and had just been their entire lives told that they were a criminal and not worthy of compensation. So again, to my knowledge, even after 2002, no gay man has publicly come forward to claim compensation.
Wow, more heartbreaking information, but really fascinating to find out how these dynamics have continued through until today. Mm-hmm. And sort of with that as a transition, I have some questions about how we experience this history today. To start, are there any memorials to the Nazis' LGBTQ victims?
So there are a few now. The push to build memorials to, again, it kind of always begins with the gay men. So there was a push to memorialize the men with the pink triangle. That began in West Germany in the 1980s. But actually, the very first memorial to the Nazis' gay victims was not in East Germany. It was not in West Germany. It was in Austria. At the Mauthausen concentration camp. This was in 1980. Oh, I should know this. It's either 84 or 85. I believe it was early 1985. And actually, West German gay rights activists were incredibly mad that, a non-German country was able to acknowledge German victims of German government before any of the contemporary German, gay activists. So they really, it motivated them to continue their own commemoration efforts. And so in later in 1985, which was the 40th anniversary of the end of the war, a group of gay organizers in Munich decide to apply to construct a pink granite memorial at Dachau concentration camp site. And so they apply. The directors of the Dachau Memorial Committee reject the application, and ultimately leading to a 10-year-long battle for the placement of this pink triangle memorial. Actually, I forgot. I have a picture of it, so you can see what it looks like. So these folks applied to have it placed in 1985, but it was not allowed to be placed in Dachau until 1995. So this just gives you a taste of the backlash of even building a memorial to these particular victims. Now, today and by 2022, there are a total of 12 memorials to the gay victims in Germany, including a national one in Berlin, which you can see up here in the top right. It was dedicated in 2008. And then in addition to the 12 that are in Germany, there are 11 pink triangle monuments across the world. And so really, I think that this shows that this history is no longer understood as just a specifically German history that only Germans should care about, but instead is, it has a global lesson for everyone to learn about, human rights and human rights violations. However, one would be forgiven for thinking that this is kind of a success story, that it took a long time, but finally we have these memorials and everyone, lived happily ever after. But I do want to end by telling one story about this particular memorial. In German, it's called the Gedenkkugel, which translates to the memorial sphere. Beginning in 2016, a group of scholars and activists applied to essentially set this concrete ball, this memorial ball, at Ravensbrück concentration camp, which was the women's concentration camp. And this memorial ball is specifically dedicated to the lesbian victims. So in 2016, their application was denied. And the argument, including from gay male historians, was that lesbians were not really victims of Nazism since they weren't persecuted under a single law like paragraph 175, right? But of course, this completely overlooks the fact that the Nazis sought to create a society in which it was impossible for any LGBTQ person, including lesbians, to openly express their identity, right? So yes, they might not have had one particular law. Clearly, they were persecuted for who they were, who they loved, and how they acted. This debate about this memorial sphere went on for year after year after year. The Ravensbrück concentration camp said you can come and bring this ball, you can have a moment of silence, but then you have to take it with you when you leave. It was not until last year, so it hasn't even been a full year. Last year, finally, the organizers were victorious in getting permission to permanently keep this memorial at Ravensbrück. And so this coming April, in just a few months, this sphere will be dedicated and permanently placed at the Ravensbrück concentration camp memorial. So all of this to say, while there is a lot of progress that's being done, this is not an issue that is settled, that we are still having these debates about who gets, who is considered a victim, who is not, and who gets to control history. So these are important debates that are constantly continuing.
Absolutely. And I'll say one person put in the chat, and I think this is just very timely to that slide. Someone asked, what is written on the sphere?
Oh, I should have had the script in front of me. I will place it, if for anyone who's interested, I can put a link in the chat. It essentially says, to the lesbian women who were murdered in Ravensbrück for being asocial, for being different, for not doing their duty. And so even the inscription, it ends by saying you are not forgotten. And so even the inscription acknowledges that no, there wasn't a specific lesbian triangle, for example, or a lesbian law, but that does not mean that lesbians weren't persecuted. They were persecuted and labeled as asocial or as a political opponent or as a criminal. I think that, to me, that underscores how dangerous it is to understand this history solely through the Nazis' lens, right? Because if we were to look at this and say, we're only going to acknowledge this by that chart, we're only going to acknowledge victims by the Nazis, prisoner colored triangle chart, that leaves a lot of people out. And I personally find it really problematic to try to define victims by just judging, based on the Nazi standards, because they had certain intentions, but those intentions ultimately had repercussions that rippled all across, not just Germany, all across occupied Europe. And so I really appreciate the nuance of the inscription on the sphere.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And with the knowledge that this has only just happened in the last year, that we continue to be able to have these conversations, what do you feel are some of the most important lessons that we can take away from this entire history?
I think that's a dangerous question to ask a historian. Just because I have thought about this, right? As I've dedicated my life to studying this really hard, dark history, what can we draw from it, right? And so I thought about this question a lot and have identified, I think, at least what I tell myself are two kind of key lessons. And the first is that memories have power, right? How we remember the past can and should influence how we live our lives today in the present. But remembering is not enough, right? Remembering must have consequences. So I think it is a disservice, right, to pay lip service to a past injustice if we are not willing to put in the work towards rectifying that injustice and preventing it from happening again. So again, I think, remembering just has to have consequences. But I think probably the most important lesson that I have gained from studying this history is that progress that is made in regards to human rights is always fragile, right? So in the middle of the 20th century, queer Germans had built the most dynamic and tolerant place for LGBTQ people in the world. But when the Nazis came to power through the democratic process, I remember, they destroyed that progress within a matter of weeks, at least in Berlin. I mean, it had been built up over 10, 15 years, but within a matter of weeks, it was able to be pushed back underground. And it speaks to the fact that minorities are just not automatically better off in a democracy, right? Because if you look at this history, West Germany, a new democracy, continued to use this fascist law for 20 years. So at the same time that all the allies were persecuting LGBTQ people in their own countries. And so if we want a society that acknowledges and protects the right of people who have been marginalized, we have to actively build that society, right? We have to pass legislation, we have to lobby, we have to protect these marginalized communities, because it's not going to happen on its own. And one of the last things that I would like to mention specifically about this history is that homophobic and transphobic rhetoric is often a red flag for broader developments towards repressive movements and repressive policies, right? LGBTQ folks were among the very first of the Nazis' victims because the Nazis knew that this was a group that most Germans either openly despised or didn't care about, right? So campaigning against LGBT people was a way of forming a broader coalition among other right-wing nationalists, which then this coalition was used to attack a whole slew of other minorities, including, primarily Jews. So I think that, recognizing that homophobia, transphobia isn't just an issue that is relevant for gay people or trans people is important, because if you even just look at what's been happening in our own country for the past several years, you really can see some of this playing out, not in history, but in current day. Our LGBTQ communities across this country have fought for and won many rights, including marriage equality and legal protection from a number of discriminations. But under the previous administration, we have witnessed a truly staggering attack on these rights. The Human Rights Campaign I saw just announced that currently there are 17 anti-LGBT, most of them are anti-trans laws that are on the books as proposed currently, making last year the worst year on record for LGBT legislation. So I think it's not a coincidence that at the same time we are witnessing this attack on LGBTQ rights, but it's the same time that the same movement, the same atmosphere that brought right-wing, neo-fascists to attack the seat of our democracy in Washington, D.C. So I will wrap up by saying that I think that the history, of the Holocaust teaches us that fascism doesn't show up overnight, right? The Holocaust didn't start with Auschwitz. It was a long, gradual process of dehumanization that began with words that eventually manifested in actions and political policies. So I believe that we really do the Nazis' victims a disservice if we turn a blind eye to the warning signs, some of these signs that aren't even subtle, right? I mean, marching against the Capitol. If we claim to memorialize this history, but then ignore those warning signs today. So we really can't grow complacent, right? The threat of nativism and racism and anti-Semitism didn't leave America when the previous administration left the White House. So we really have to take this charge of never again personally in our day-to-day lives.
Absolutely. It's so important, and I'm so grateful for you really giving voice to that. I've got two more questions for you. One is an audience question, and one is sort of our wrap-up question. One person asked, what is your opinion of the current consumerization of the pink triangle that came out of this post-war gay movement?
Oh, I have lots of thoughts on that, and I think that I will give an answer that probably is not the right answer. You know, it's not the only answer. I will say. That is the beautifully ambivalent nature of symbols, right? That it could be made with one meaning, but then it takes on new meaning with every single person that decides to pick it up and wear it. So you can see I am wearing a pink triangle pin tonight as a way to commemorate all of the people that I have researched and read and written about, the people that aren't here to tell their own stories, but also as a way to signal that this history isn't just history, right? These things continue to happen today. Now, I do understand that, especially by the late 1990s, when the rainbow flag was really becoming the predominant symbol of the LGBTQ community, it's kind of like our community, or some people in our community, forgot what the pink triangle was or where it came from. And so then you start to see pink triangles. I've seen, I kid you not, a pink triangle lager, a beer named the Pink Triangle Lager. I've seen, in 2018, Nike released a series of shoes and socks and athletic wear featuring the pink triangle. And when they were heavily criticized for trying to profit off of the gay community by slapping the symbol on there when they maybe didn't know the history of it. So you see it in Lady Gaga's music video, in Todrick Hall's music videos. And so it has become, sometimes even when it's become depoliticized, it's still a marker of queer culture. And I have to remind myself not to be too harsh on folks who might wear it today and actually don't know what the history of it is, because, as I said, symbols take on power that we give it. And so if they want to buy it and it means only queer pride, then that's their prerogative. I choose to remember the history behind it too.
Incredible. So there have been a number of folks posting in the chats the knowledge that they have about this topic, as well the books they've read. But I was wondering, do you have any resources that you would suggest for anyone who's interested in learning more about this?
So I have spent the past little while collecting a lot of resources as I've done my research, and compiled them all really conveniently here on my website. You can go to it at wjakenewsome.com/resources. And I have them all organized, everything from digital lectures that you can watch on YouTube, podcasts, articles that you can read, lesson plans for teachers, essentially everything that I can find from other researchers, but also other institutions, Holocaust education institutions, for example. Tried to find this, to make this a one-stop shop where you can go and find the latest information on the persecution of queer folks during, but also after the Holocaust.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And just so folks know, Sophie put into the chat the link itself, so people can click that link if they are interested in getting access to those resources. Thank you so much for the live link, Sophie. And I want to close this program out by thanking so many people. I want to thank Dr. Newsome for your incredible scholarship, for your words, for this wonderfully engaging program. I'd love to thank Sophie and the entire Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation. I want to thank Rodef Shalom, and especially Prism at Rodef Shalom, and innumerable people who helped make this program happen. I want to thank everybody here for attending. Your presence here and being witness to this information, to this learning. You are the reason that this program exists, and I'm so grateful for your presence in making this such a wonderful learning moment. I want to let people know there will be flyers and more information closer to the date, but on June 18th, we are going to have a larger program at the Philadelphia Holocaust Memorial on the topic of LGBTQ victims of the Holocaust. It will be in person, it will be a Havdalah program, and we will get to do some in-person outdoor learning in warm weather during Pride Month. So if you enjoyed learning this information, if you felt moved or touched, please do join us that day as well. And thank you all so much for being here.
Everyone, thank you again, Dr. Newsome. Thanks, Ira and Roberta and the whole Brenner family. Appreciate the support so much. Great to see everyone. Have a wonderful night.
Yeah, thank you. I also wanted to say thank you to the Brenner family, and thanks for sharing that story about your family. That was really important and moving. I appreciate y'all's support.
Thank you.
Sophie and Galia, really just wonderful job. Really beautiful.
Wonderful program.
Excellent.
And thank you to Stephen. Is he still? Oh, there you are. I forgot to thank you, Stephen. You really have been just phenomenal helping to organize all this. We are so lucky to have you at RS.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Brenners, Sophie, Galia, Jake. It was really wonderful.
Good night, everyone.